All right, well, hopefully we are all set up and ready to go. This is going to be a pretty quick stream. If you're here and you're in the chat and you're able to hear, please do let me know before I get started. But wow, this is pretty wild over here. Pretty wild. If anyone ever told you that defund the police doesn't mean defund the police, and abolish the police doesn't mean abolish the police, you can point them to what's happening in Seattle. This Christopher Rufos tweeting out breaking: Seattle City Council moves to abolish the entire Seattle Police Department and replace it with a civilian-led Department of Community Safety and Violence Prevention. And here are parts of the resolution. City of Seattle resolution. A resolution related to policing and public safety, establishing the council's intent to create a civilian-led Department of Community Safety and Violence Prevention. Whereas the council recognizes that the nation's and Seattle's history of racism and the current impact of institutional racism and structural racism cause over-policing and underinvestment in communities of color, and especially in Black communities. And whereas the council is committed to confronting structural and institutional racism as a fundamental step towards addressing the racist institution of policing. So, without even going into the proposals yet, you can see that the framing here is completely distorted and completely warped. Without pointing to specific systems or specific facets of the police as an institution or the institutions of the country at large, saying that there is institutional and structural racism doesn't actually have any meaning, and it doesn't tell us anything, and it doesn't help anyone. And so that's problem number one here, obviously, is the framing here. What evidence is there that the police is a racist institution? So right away we have very general, very sweeping language that is not particularly helpful, and we are not off to a great start here. So this resolution responds to community demands for a new approach to policing in Seattle. It identifies a number of steps that the council intends to take to move towards creating a civilian-led Department of Community Safety and Violence Prevention to oversee safety and police operations, defunding the police, and funding alternatives to policing. Now, if you actually look through some of the details of the resolution, it sounds in some ways like something that reasonable people could agree to, which is that the police serve many functions which they are not well suited to fulfill, and they're overworked. They get involved in things that would better be taken care of by social workers, other mental health professionals. I think reasonable people can get behind that. So, for example, it says identifies functions currently located within the Seattle Police Department that are more appropriately housed in other city agencies. Fair enough. The police do not need to be a catch-all organization that deals with all of the ailments of society. They really primarily should be dealing with stopping and preventing crime. And so we can all sort of get behind that. But then we look at some of the more radical elements of this. Provides a timeline that describes the steps needed to move toward a new civilian-led community safety and violence prevention department. Not exactly clear what that means. I guess we'll see. And again, here we have highlighted: council and mayor introduce, consider, and act on proposed legislation creating a new Department of Community Safety and Violence Prevention. Now, if you go ahead and look at this guy's website, excuse me, Christopher, he has the documentation in total here. He has the complete docs over here. So there are some disturbing elements here, and the problem is, and I think this is something that most Americans recognize, is that Black Lives Matter and similar movements and other organizations or protesters in general, activists that are sort of waving same general banner, they are smuggling in other very radical ideology. And it is very obvious to the average person that they are smuggling in ideology. So, for example, you'll see here that, well, he quotes it here. I think it was in the other picture, but he says, it's back over here. Let's see where it was. Oh, here it is. Whereas the council is committed to confronting structural and institutional racism as a fundamental step towards addressing the racist institution of policing. Well, that's, first of all, an extremely sweeping claim that policing is a racist institution. And similarly here, whereas these protests forced many nationwide and in Seattle to confront the racism that has been plaguing the black community for centuries and spread to other communities of color, the harmful impacts of white supremacy culture, and the Seattle Police Department's role in perpetuating racism and violence. Seattle Police Department is perpetuating racism and violence and white supremacy culture. I mean, what even is the demographic makeup of the Seattle Police Department? How many black people and people of color are police officers within the Seattle Police Department? It's just a bit weird to make such a general statement as white supremacy. This is just completely overstepping the bounds here and making huge generalizations. And it's obvious to everyone that the end game here is power. This is a power grab. This is an attempt to completely reshape society and to push through a radical ideology. And another obvious reflection of that, or an example of that, is here. The city should prioritize the following near-term housing solutions. Support the immediate transfer of underutilized public land for BIPOC community ownership, that's Black, Indigenous, and people of color, including where necessary purchase and activation capital and upfront transaction costs. All empty housing stock in the city should be used until any unhoused person who wants a place to live has one. And as Christopher said very well here, in essence, the redistribution of land, which is a hallmark of Marxist regimes. So this is the problem here, is that the adults have left the room. There are no adults anymore. And the people who are putting forward these policies and trying to rush them through are essentially far left ideologues. They are the loudest, most obnoxious, and sometimes violent radicals. And for now, the political class in places like Seattle are essentially bending the knee. And what's so incredible about it is that in all likelihood, it is an extremely small minority of the citizens of Seattle who would actually support these radical proposals. They might support, and probably most people do support, some kind of reform, some sort of police reform to deal with whatever problems undoubtedly exist. But the number of people that actually support all of these radical proposals is a tiny minority. And so you have this interesting situation here, which is what Nassim Taleb refers to as the dictatorship of a small minority. It's this sort of strange situation within a democracy where the majority is supposed to rule, at least on most things, right? Some things the majority does not get to rule on. Those are the things that are in the Bill of Rights, right? We are a liberal democracy. It's not just pure democracy. And so, but certainly the majority does rule on many things, and this would fall under one of the many things that the majority gets to rule on. And so, but here you have a situation where the proposals that they are rushing to push through, it's really breathtaking. They're rushing to push this through. And if you did a poll of just the average person in Seattle, most people would not support this. So again, it's a dictatorship of the small minority where the most radical, outlandish voices are taking over, and the political class is essentially bending the knee. And so if there was any doubt as to what the ultimate goals of this movement was, and we've seen it before, we saw it in the video with one of the founders of Black Lives Matter, where she said that we are trained Marxists. Those were her words. I have a video up on my channel. You can check it out. It's very clear that they want nothing less than the complete dismantling of essentially Western norms and the institution of law and policing as we know it. What does land redistribution have anything to do with whatever reforms might reasonably be required in the Seattle Police Department? This is really just breathtaking what you have going on here. It is an attempt to completely reshape society and demand of the city, without popular support, that they make sweeping changes. And you know, another thing that's so incredible is that they talk about, you know, first of all, someone needs to fire their PR person, because first we were told that defund doesn't mean defund. Well, then why use the word defund? Abolish doesn't mean abolish. Well, then why use the word abolish? So they say, well, no, defund just means to reduce the budget of the police. But why would anyone assume, right, without evidence, that improving the police and bringing about whatever reforms might be required would require less money? For all we know, it requires more money. Like if someone told you that we needed to improve public education, right, the public school system, we need to improve it. So what are the chances that improving it equates to less money for schools? And I'm not saying there aren't situations where less money may be part of a solution. Maybe part of the problem with the public education system, for example, is that it's totally bloated and there's way too much head count and you have all this administration and these positions that didn't exist before. Fine. But in the case of policing, it is assumed without any justification that improving the police means less money. So again, you see the goals here, and you see the really sinister attempt to essentially smuggle in, right, together with proposals that could be interpreted as reasonable and incremental improvements to the Seattle Police Department, includes along with it demands that we essentially adopt far-left Marxist ideology. Again, the transfer of land and capital to the people identified in these proposals, has absolutely nothing to do with improving the police. And as Christopher says very well in his tweet, he says, "This is madness. If Seattle moves forward with its plan to abolish the police and permanently close the region's largest jail, it will lead to the immediate collapse of public order. But for now, the political class is following the mob. Beware." And he links to the full documents, as we said over here. Council endorses the Decriminalize Seattle agenda that would replace the police force with culturally relevant expertise rooted in community connections, housing, food, security, and other basic needs, trauma-informed, gender-affirming, anti-racist praxis. Gender-affirming? What does that have to do with the supposed problems of police brutality and unjustified use of force and violence by the police? And finally, the plan demands that the city conduct an immediate transfer of underutilized public land for BIPOC community ownership. In essence, the redistribution of land, which is a hallmark of Marxist regimes. We saw that in his tweet. I encourage you to look through the full documentation here, because it's really a blueprint or a model for how far-left cities are moving forward with breathtaking speed, really, without considering all of the implications of this, and without even doing so much as very basic polling to figure out what the majority of citizens actually want. And honestly, I do think that the majority of citizens probably would support some type of incremental reform to the city's programs, and the police department included in that. But this is a complete, essentially, installation of a racialist kind of regime and social justice program that attempts to use this situation in order to bring that about. And again, this is really a blueprint for other places, Seattle being an extremely far left city. But like I said, even as far left as Seattle is, what is so strange about this is that the majority of the citizens probably don't support such radical proposals, even as far left as it is. And so it's an example of how the loudest, most obnoxious, craziest, most radical people can take the governance of a city, and in some cases of a country, hostage, and demand changes that most people don't actually support. And it's very dangerous. It's very, very dangerous in general when people are in a state of alarm, where there's this sort of impulse to implement sweeping changes. It's a very dangerous thing, because tinkering with these different elements of civilization and of society have huge effects, knock-on effects, and unintended consequences. It's a reason why the framers of the Constitution in the first place actually set up so many checks and balances, because they actually wanted the legislative branch, certainly Congress, right, to be an inertial body, meaning they shouldn't be able to get so many things done so quickly, so easily, because there is they wanted to put up sort of stumbling blocks in front of them. To have a very activist legislature is a very dangerous thing. But you're seeing on the local level now, places like Portland and Seattle basically bend the knee and be held hostage by these far left ideologues. And so the next time that someone tells you that, well, no, defund the police and abolish the police just means, these very reasonable incremental reforms in order to improve the police department, and they're things that anyone can get behind. Well, you'll see that what they're doing, and they do this in so many of the protests, and so much of the movement, is they sort of throw out these symbols that, to the people who are in the know that they represent extremely radical proposals. But they can hide behind the sort of vagueness of it, and the kind of tricky use of language to say to the people who might find that less than palatable that really this does not represent any sort of extreme. It's like at some of the protests in Portland, for example, they would have like the flag upside down. And so to more sort of centrist, less radical people, an upside down flag, they can say, well, that just means that we're patriotic, but the US has problems that needs to be addressed. But to the people in the know, they know that that's nothing less than the symbol of America is a racist, evil, colonial power. None of the principles upon which this country was founded are good and virtuous, and we want nothing less than the overthrow of the Western liberal democracy that is the United States. Anyways, this was just an impromptu stream. Wanted to bring this to your attention. Let me know what you guys think in the comments. Am I overreacting to this? Is this something that really should raise alarm bells for people? Anyways, as always, thanks for watching, and please like the video and subscribe. By far the best way that you can help me continue to